Hey guys, tonight we venture into medieval times. Imagine it now. It's the 12th century. The air is thick with the scent of damp wood, sweat, and the occasional whiff of unwashed bodies. You stand in a bustling village surrounded by muddy streets and wooden huts that are barely holding together. Your teeth? A lovely shade of brown, thanks to your diet and lack of brushing. Your clothes? A few layers of wool, itchy and smelly, and that's after you've been working in them all day. And just so you know, you probably won't survive this. Your odds? Slim to none. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really helps out, and I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, so drop a comment with your location and the local time. It's awesome to see how far and wide our audience is on this channel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start by walking through a day in the life of a medieval peasant. Your day begins at dawn. If you're lucky, you've had at least a few hours of sleep. It's cold, the wind howls through your thatched roof, and the bed you're in is little more than a pile of straw with a blanket that smells like last winter's mud. You wake up sore, because your bed is essentially a mattress made of discomfort, and the first thing you notice is that you don't have to worry about the comfort of your bed anymore. Because, well, you're awake. There's a long, miserable day of labor ahead, and your body's already screaming at you for it. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were truly as miserable as we think. Some say their lives were simple, they had close-knit communities, and their work was hard but often fulfilling. Others claim that they were stuck in a never-ending cycle of hardship, barely scraping by. Either way, you're pretty much locked in the cycle of work, eat, die, with little hope of breaking free. But before we dig too deep into how you'd barely make it through a day, let's talk about the conditions you'd face, starting with, well, everything medieval people didn't have. And I mean everything. For instance, let's look at hygiene, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Now that you're already picturing a day of sweat, dirt, and discomfort, let's dive into a little detail about one thing you definitely wouldn't have survived: medieval hygiene, or the shocking lack of it. Picture this: you've been working in the fields all day, covered in mud, and the closest thing to a shower is an icy river that you have to wade through in the middle of winter. And let's be real, you're not exactly leaping in for a refreshing soak. There's no soap, no shampoo, no fluffy towels to wrap yourself in. Your best bet is to dip your hands in the water and hope you don't come out with something worse than dirt. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually thought hygiene was important. Some argue that personal cleanliness wasn't seen as a priority. Others suggest that medieval folk did, in fact, attempt to keep clean but just didn't have the means to do so. Either way, you can forget about smelling like anything other than wet wool and animal dung. Even the rich weren't exempt, though they had access to some fragrant herbs and the occasional bath, often in a wooden tub. But for peasants? You were lucky if your skin wasn't permanently caked with dirt and lice. Let's not forget the fun little critters: lice, fleas, and even bedbugs, who were your constant companions. These bugs weren't just a nuisance, they were a part of life, and they loved your hair, your clothes, and especially your skin. What do you do when these creatures make their home in your body and clothing? You scratch, and you scratch some more. It's a never-ending cycle of itchiness, and as if that wasn't enough, your clothes would likely be filled with them, too. You could try wearing furs to bed, but guess what? They weren't clean, and the fleas loved them just as much as they loved your skin. It was a full-on infestation party. Remember, it wasn't just you battling the bugs. You also had to deal with the stench of your surroundings. There's no deodorant, no perfume to mask the reality of a long day's work. In fact, bathhouses were considered a luxury, and the idea of showering regularly simply didn't exist. In fact, many believe that frequent bathing actually invited diseases. After all, the water wasn't exactly sparkling, and the public baths were often cesspools of filth. So, you wake up covered in your own sweat and the remnants of a horrible night's sleep, drag yourself to work, then return to the same filthy conditions. You're not dead yet, but the chances of catching something aren't looking too good. But there's something even worse: the food you eat. So, let's talk about that next. Alright, so after a long day of sweating, scratching, and dodging disease, you're probably hungry, aren't we all? But before you even think about sinking your teeth into something that vaguely resembles food, let's talk about your medieval diet. Spoiler alert, you wouldn't be eating anything close to what you're used to today. Forget about fresh fruits, vibrant vegetables, or any kind of nutritional balance. The medieval peasant diet was about survival, not pleasure, and it definitely wasn't gourmet. Let's start with the basics: bread. It wasn't your fluffy, soft wonder loaf, but rather dense, dark, and made mostly from rye, barley, or oats. If you were lucky, your bread might have been freshly baked that day, but more often than not, it was stale and covered in mold. Moldy bread wasn't exactly a delicacy, but it was a frequent snack in many medieval homes. And since fresh fruit and vegetables weren't readily available, you could imagine your diet being mostly made up of this sad, grain-based existence. Historians still debate whether medieval people actually enjoyed their bread or if they simply endured it out of necessity. Some argue that bread was, in fact, an important part of their daily nutrition, while others suggest it was more of a bland filler, giving them just enough energy to get through their grueling workdays. Whatever the case, a diet like that would leave you with a lack of variety, meaning you could forget about all those fancy foods like leafy greens, nuts, and vibrant salads. Instead, you'd munch on the occasional vegetable stew or, for the luckier ones, some cheap cheese. But don't get too excited. The cheese wasn't the kind you'd want to pair with wine for a refined snack. It was more likely to be stale, moldy, and unpleasantly pungent, often made with questionable milk that you wouldn't even want to look at too closely. And if you think milk is an option? Think again. Chances are your milk had spoiled long before it made it to your mug. As for meat, that was a rare treat, usually reserved for the upper classes. If you were a peasant, your chances of eating meat were slim, and if you did get your hands on some, it would likely be salted, dried, or pickled, anything to preserve it. Think about chewing through tough, dried-out chunks of mystery meat. You'd need all the energy just to get through that. And heaven forbid you get your hands on a spoiled piece. There was no refrigeration, and food-borne illnesses were rampant. You could expect a side of food poisoning to accompany your every meal. But let's not forget about the lack of spices. There were a few herbs to throw in, but nothing like the rich variety of seasonings you'd find in a modern kitchen. Your stew? Bland and unappetizing. Your bread? Dry and unyielding. And what would wash it all down? Water, possibly from a stream contaminated by all the waste piling up. You could forget about clean, purified drinking water unless you were living in a wealthier household. Even the water you drank probably wasn't all that safe, and you'd be more than likely dealing with stomach issues on a regular basis. Cheers! But the real kicker? The occasional surprise of maggots or worms crawling through your food. Maybe you try to scoop them out, or maybe you just eat them with the bread because, hey, you were hungry, and there was no better option. So now you're working your back off, scratching your way through a bug-infested night, eating food that might as well be a punishment, and surviving mostly on moldy bread and questionable meat. Not exactly your dream life, right? But it gets worse. Just when you thought you couldn't get any lower, the real medieval horrors make an appearance: disease. So, there you are, trying to eat your moldy bread and hoping your stomach doesn't betray you with a nasty bout of food poisoning, when suddenly, you realize you might not even make it through the night. Medieval diseases were basically your invisible, ever-present companions. And no, they weren't just going to politely knock on your door before they claimed your life. They'd creep up on you, no warning, no mercy. First up, let's talk about the Black Death. You've probably heard about it, this plague that wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. But here's the thing you probably didn't know: it didn't just come out of nowhere. The Black Death wasn't some dramatic, once-in-a-lifetime event. It was just one of the many plagues that swept through medieval society, claiming lives left and right. And no one really knew how to stop it. They didn't understand germs, bacteria, or viruses. The medieval doctor? They didn't have antibiotics. They had leeches, questionable potions, and prayers. And maybe a few good luck charms. But that wasn't going to save you when you started running a fever or developing mysterious boils on your body. Spoiler alert, you wouldn't survive the Black Death. Your chances were slim. People in those times had no concept of quarantine or disease control. Instead, they just watched helplessly as entire villages were wiped out in a matter of weeks. But the plague wasn't the only nasty surprise waiting for you in the Middle Ages. There was also dysentery, which was probably the more common affliction you'd be dealing with. You'd be lucky to find clean water, which meant you were probably drinking from contaminated streams or wells, which in turn led to stomach problems that could, at best, keep you on the toilet for hours, and at worst, kill you within days. You'd probably be too weak from dehydration to even care about the moldy bread you've been gnawing on all week. Historians still argue whether dysentery was the leading cause of death during the medieval period, but one thing's for sure, it wasn't pretty. Then there's the ever-present threat of smallpox, a viral infection that made your skin blister and scar. You could get lucky and survive, but it would leave you with permanent scarring, which, in medieval times, could be more socially devastating than the illness itself. And even if smallpox didn't get you, tuberculosis probably would. The disease would slowly take over your body, attacking your lungs, and eventually you'd cough yourself to death, barely able to breathe. All the while, no one knew what was actually causing it, so you'd be given ineffective treatments like breathing in steam or trying some kind of herbal remedy. And then, there were the everyday issues, rashes, infections, or worse, the kind of medical problems that would never be treated properly, leaving you to deal with them on your own. To make matters worse, medieval medicine wasn't exactly what you'd call effective. Bloodletting was the go-to treatment for just about anything. Got a headache? Bloodletting. Stomachache? Bloodletting. Dying? Yep, you guessed it, bloodletting. Doctors believed that by draining your blood, they could balance your humors and restore health. So you'd probably end up being bled until you felt faint, only to find yourself sicker than before. Historians still argue whether this practice did more harm than good, but it certainly wasn't the miracle cure they thought it was. Oh, and just in case you weren't feeling miserable enough, let's talk about your dental situation. Medieval dentistry? Non-existent. Forget about your nice, shiny smile. Without proper care, you'd be dealing with tooth decay, abscesses, and broken teeth all your life. Your teeth would rot away, causing severe pain and making it difficult to eat anything besides soft, bland food. And don't think you could just pop by the dentist for a quick fix. In the medieval world, the best option you had was having someone yank out the infected tooth with a pair of pliers. Imagine trying to stay calm while your neighbor pulls out your tooth with zero anesthesia. Yikes. But let's say you do survive the diseases, the terrible diet, and the lack of dental care. Maybe you get through the plague without catching it, and somehow your stomach manages to hold out despite your questionable food options. Even if you survive all that, there's still the threat of physical injury. Alright, you've somehow managed to make it through the diseases, the lack of proper medical care, and your sad, toothless smile. But the odds aren't exactly in your favor. Because now, let's talk about the physical injuries you'd face. And trust me, it's not pretty. Medieval life wasn't exactly known for its safety standards. In fact, you were probably living on the edge every single day. Let's say you're working in the fields, trying to harvest some crops or chop wood with a dull axe. No big deal, right? Wrong. You know what's coming next. You're probably going to cut yourself, maybe deeply, because your tools weren't exactly made with ergonomics or safety in mind. And the odds of getting an infection from that wound? Oh, they're high. Real high. See, back in the day, your chances of getting infected were much higher than they are now. The concept of sterilizing tools wasn't even a blip on the medieval radar. So, imagine you're dealing with a cut or a wound. The thing might fester, turn gangrenous, and before you know it, your leg's being amputated. If you're lucky enough to survive the amputation, that is. But hey, you're tough, right? You're a survivor. Even if you somehow avoid injury on the farm or while working the land, there's still a good chance that something will go horribly wrong during a joust or a tournament. Let's face it, there's a good chance you'd find yourself on horseback, wearing a heavy suit of armor, trying to knock someone else off their horse. Sounds fun, doesn't it? Except, it's incredibly dangerous. You could easily get thrown off your horse, trampled, or even impaled by your opponent's lance. And after the competition? You'd probably end up with broken bones or internal injuries, and you'd be expected to get back up and fight again. Oh, and let's not even talk about the fact that armor wasn't exactly designed for comfort. You'd probably be sweating buckets in that thing, chafing in all the wrong places, while desperately trying to stay alive. And if you're not fighting in jousting tournaments, your next big risk might come from simply walking around in the town square. Medieval cities were cramped, filthy, and poorly planned. There were no sidewalks, no street lights, and certainly no "Please watch your step" signs. You'd be dodging horse carts, unpaved roads, and probably a lot of human waste, which, by the way, was often just dumped in the streets. The smell alone might knock you out, but if you're unlucky, you could trip on the uneven ground and break a leg. And trust me, a broken leg in medieval times? It's a one-way ticket to an early grave. There's no hospital, no cast, and no painkillers to ease the agony. You'd be left to limp around with your leg in a makeshift splint, praying it wouldn't get infected. But chances are it would. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of war. In the medieval period, conflicts were frequent and often brutal. Whether you were a peasant pressed into service or a knight heading off to fight in a crusade, your chances of surviving a battle weren't great. Armor wasn't perfect, and weapons were designed to cause maximum damage. You could get pierced by arrows, slashed by swords, or crushed by a falling horse. Even if you managed to avoid the worst injuries, you'd still be looking at the possibility of suffering from long-term trauma, whether that's from an infected wound, a traumatic brain injury, or even the mental scars of what you'd experienced. In addition to the physical injuries that could end your life, you'd also have to contend with the utter lack of sanitation in medieval times. A small cut could become a massive problem. Because, without proper hygiene, even something as simple as a nick could escalate into a life-threatening infection. And in a world without antibiotics, it was basically a waiting game to see if you'd survive. If the infection spread to your bloodstream, you'd be in for a rough time. Your body would be fighting a battle it wasn't equipped to win, and the chances of survival were slim. If you didn't die of the wound, the infection might do the job for you. Even the smallest injury, the kind we would dismiss today with a band-aid, could be a death sentence. Your chances of survival in the medieval world, especially as a commoner, weren't just slim, they were practically non-existent. Sure, you could fight tooth and nail to stay alive, but life was hard, and the odds were against you. And if you did manage to survive all of that, well, then you'd be dealing with the mental and emotional scars that came with it. The stress, the fear, the constant anxiety of knowing that one wrong step could send you to an early grave. It would take its toll on you. Historians still argue whether the medieval mindset was truly shaped by this constant fear of death, or if it was just an inevitable part of the brutal existence they led. But one thing is for sure, you wouldn't last long in a world like that. Even the hardiest of souls would eventually succumb to the relentless onslaught of medieval life. So, after surviving the dangers of physical injury, let's talk about the mental strain of medieval life. You're alive, sure, but let's face it, it's not like you'd be enjoying yourself. You've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, and let's not sugarcoat it, medieval society didn't exactly give you a lot of room to breathe. Imagine it, you wake up every day knowing that you're a peasant, which means you have absolutely no power. Your life is a cycle of farming, feudal obligations, and paying taxes to your lord. Oh, and there's no end in sight. Every day, you're just trying to survive. And you're doing this while the threat of famine, plague, or war looms over you. Fun, right? And it's not like you can just hop on a plane to the next town to escape your problems. Travel in the medieval world was slow, dangerous, and expensive. Getting away from it all wasn't an option unless you were a knight with the means to travel in style. For the rest of you, it's a lifelong slog of living in a cramped, filthy hut with barely enough food to keep you going. But it's not just your living conditions that are mentally draining, it's the constant fear of death. You could get sick and die within days from an illness that, today, we could treat with a simple trip to the doctor. But in the medieval world, sickness was like a death sentence. If you had the misfortune of getting the plague or contracting dysentery, there was little to no chance of surviving. And that fear was a constant undercurrent to your every action. On top of that, the medieval church was always there to remind you that your soul was in danger. You couldn't just live your life without worrying about whether you were pleasing God. If you failed in some way, you risked eternal damnation. And if you got caught up in something like a heretical movement, or violated any religious rules, you could face severe punishment, torture, imprisonment, or even death. Your very soul was constantly at stake. Historians still argue about the level of actual fear medieval people had about their fate in the afterlife. Was it more about social control, or did people genuinely fear the wrath of God? Either way, the constant mental and emotional pressure would have been overwhelming. Every decision you made had to be carefully weighed, knowing that you might be judged for it later. And there were no therapy sessions or support groups to help you navigate it. And then there's the social hierarchy. Even if you weren't a peasant, your life wasn't exactly full of freedom. As a knight or a lord, you'd still be bound by a rigid set of rules, expectations, and duties. Your every action was scrutinized, and your reputation was everything. If you messed up, your status could be stripped away in an instant, and you could be left with nothing. The constant need to maintain appearances, keep your position, and avoid scandal would have been mentally exhausting. Even the smallest mistake could lead to humiliation or worse. You'd be living in a world where public shame could destroy your entire life. The societal pressure to conform was staggering, especially for women. If you were a woman in medieval times, forget about personal freedom. Your life was likely spent in the service of a husband or father. Your purpose was to marry, have children, and maintain a household. The idea of choosing your own path in life? Well, it didn't exist. You'd be forced into a box, expected to behave in a very specific way. And if you stepped out of line, you risked being branded as a witch or a heretic, which could lead to torture and execution. And speaking of execution, let's talk about the terrifying punishments medieval society had in store for people who broke the rules. If you were unlucky enough to be caught committing a crime, the chances of you facing a horrific public execution were high. You could be hanged, beheaded, or even drawn and quartered. Crimes like theft, adultery, or speaking out against the king were punishable by brutal death. And the worst part? These executions were public spectacles, meant to serve as a warning to others. So, not only would you be facing death, but you'd also be paraded through the streets for everyone to see. The constant awareness of your own mortality, coupled with the endless social pressures, would have made it nearly impossible to relax. You could barely step outside without worrying about offending someone, breaking a law, or triggering some divine wrath. Your whole life would be like walking on eggshells. Historians still argue whether this fear-driven society was a product of religious dogma or just a reflection of the brutality of the times. But one thing's for sure, you wouldn't be able to catch a break. The constant mental and emotional stress would eat away at you, leaving little room for joy or personal freedom. And without a way to cope, you'd be worn down, mentally drained, and probably wondering if it was worth it to survive another day. So, even if you managed to avoid injury, disease, and war, you'd still be battling your own mind. And given the oppressive nature of the times, surviving medieval life without going completely mad would be an impressive feat. Okay, you've made it this far, but now it's time to talk about one of the biggest challenges you'd face in medieval life: hygiene, or rather, the lack thereof. The medieval world wasn't exactly known for its cleanliness, and as much as we romanticize the past, life back then would have had you constantly surrounded by filth. And I'm not just talking about a little dust on your shoes. I'm talking about living in a world where personal hygiene wasn't just optional, it was almost unheard of. First off, let's get one thing straight: bathing was not a regular occurrence. Forget about jumping into a nice warm shower every morning, or enjoying the luxury of modern soap. medieval people, for the most part, didn't see the point of regular bathing. In fact, many believed that bathing could be harmful to your health. They thought the process could open your pores, allowing bad air or disease to enter your body. So, most people, peasants and lords alike, would only bathe a few times a year, if that. And when they did bathe, it wasn't exactly a spa experience. People would gather in communal bathhouses where public bathing was the norm. But these places weren't as clean as they sound. The water was used by dozens, if not hundreds, of people a day. That means you were probably soaking in some not-so-pleasant substances. The idea of a clean, soothing bath was, well, a bit of a stretch. Bathhouses were also prime locations for spreading disease, especially in cities, where overcrowding and poor sanitation were rampant. Diseases like cholera and the plague could spread like wildfire in these environments, making the very act of trying to clean yourself a health risk. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly unaware of hygiene, or whether they simply prioritized other aspects of life over cleanliness. Either way, it's safe to say that, unless you were lucky enough to live in a more progressive region, you would have been constantly dealing with some level of dirt and grime. Even if you did manage to take a bath every now and then, there was no guarantee that your body, or your clothes, would stay clean for long. Let's talk about your clothes for a second. If you're a peasant, you're probably wearing wool or linen garments that are cheap and practical. But these materials don't exactly breathe well, and without modern laundry methods, your clothes would get sweaty, dirty, and smelly in no time. And unless you're getting new clothes, you'd likely wear the same ones every day. This, of course, means you'd have the distinct pleasure of constantly smelling your own body odor, along with the scent of manure, sweat, and whatever else is floating around your little medieval hut. And speaking of huts, let's dive into your living conditions. You're in a small, cramped, and often dark space that's shared with your family, and maybe some animals too. Animals were commonly kept in the same dwelling spaces as humans, especially in the winter, when the warmth they provided was vital. This meant that your living quarters were likely covered in animal waste, and you'd be stepping around mud and straw on the floor. The smell would be overwhelming, and the lack of ventilation would make it hard to breathe, let alone get any restful sleep. But wait, it gets worse. If you lived in a village, you'd be dealing with open sewage and waste in the streets. There were no proper sewage systems, so waste would often be thrown into the streets or dumped into a nearby river. Can you imagine the smell of raw sewage wafting through your village, mixing with the stench of unbathed people and rotting food? This was a reality for most people living in medieval cities and towns. And if you were lucky enough to avoid contracting a disease from all the filth around you, consider yourself fortunate. Historians still debate whether medieval people truly suffered from the lack of hygiene, or whether their immune systems were more robust than ours. There's even some argument that medieval diets and lifestyles may have given them a level of resistance to certain diseases that we don't have today. Still, it's safe to say that medieval living conditions weren't exactly designed for comfort or cleanliness. And the constant exposure to disease and poor hygiene would have made life far less enjoyable than we tend to imagine. Even those who were wealthier and lived in castles weren't exactly living in luxury when it came to cleanliness. While they may have had more space and access to better food, castles were far from sterile environments. Castles were drafty, poorly lit, and often damp, with little ventilation. As for the royalty and nobles, they may have had more frequent access to baths, but the quality of those baths and the cleanliness of their surroundings were still subpar. And of course, the smell. Oh, the smell! They might have smelled a little better than the peasants, but only by a tiny margin. So, even if you had some degree of wealth or status, you weren't exactly escaping the grimy, unsanitary reality of medieval life. And let's not forget that all of this filth would attract pests. Rats, lice, fleas, and ticks would be your constant companions. If you weren't battling the unbearable stench, you'd be fighting off itchy bites, scratching your head from lice, or trying to keep your food safe from the rats that roamed freely. Historians still argue about how much people in medieval times actually understood about the connection between hygiene and health. Did they truly believe that dirt was evil? Or did they just not have the knowledge or technology to make better choices? Either way, you wouldn't want to spend more than a day in their shoes. or rather, their filthy, sweat-soaked clothing. At the end of the day, surviving medieval hygiene would take a real tolerance for discomfort. You could try to scrub yourself clean, but the reality is that the medieval world wasn't exactly built with cleanliness in mind. The smell, the dirt, the pests, it would all be an inescapable part of your daily existence. Now, let's talk about something that will really have you rethinking your medieval aspirations: food. Sure, you're probably imagining yourself feasting like a king, biting into tender roasted meats, and sipping fine wine. But my friend, unless you're royalty or one of the elite, your daily meals are going to be a lot less glamorous and a lot more grim. First off, let's consider your diet. If you're a peasant, you're eating the same thing day in and day out: bread, porridge, and maybe a few vegetables if you're lucky. Meat? That's a rare treat, usually reserved for festivals or special occasions. You might get the occasional rabbit or chicken, but for the most part, your meals are made up of grains like barley, oats, and rye. And it's not the whole grain goodness we're talking about today. No, it's rough, coarse flour, baked into dense, heavy loaves that will fill you up, but not exactly with joy. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval bread wasn't exactly the same as the stuff you're buying at the bakery today. It was often full of weevils and bugs. Yep, your daily bread would sometimes come with an extra protein boost in the form of critters. And speaking of critters, the way bread was stored meant it often got moldy or stale very quickly. So you could have a slice of bread with a side of bugs, or you could have it stale, rock hard, and definitely not appetizing. And then there's the porridge. It's pretty much the one thing you're going to be eating for breakfast, and sometimes dinner. It's cheap, filling, and made from whatever grain you've got on hand. Sometimes it's sweetened with honey or fruit, but more often than not, it's just a bland, mushy mess that you're expected to choke down. And if the grain's in short supply, your porridge might even be watery and tasteless. Not exactly the type of meal that would make you feel energized or happy. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants ate enough to sustain themselves or whether their diets were lacking in vital nutrients. One thing is for sure, though, the food they ate wasn't exactly a treat for the taste buds. For the majority of the population, meals were a matter of survival, not enjoyment. Now, let's talk about the meat, or lack thereof. If you're a lowly peasant, chances are you're not eating much meat at all. The aristocracy in the church had a stranglehold on hunting rights, meaning that forests and game-filled lands were pretty much off-limits to the average person. Meat would come in the form of cheap, small game like rabbits or chickens, and if you were lucky, maybe a pig or cow that was slaughtered for a special occasion. And forget about variety. What you get is usually all you're going to get. But even if you manage to snag some meat, it's not going to be the juicy, tender cuts you dream of. Meat was often salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it, making it tough and, well, salty. Eating meat like that would be a bit like gnawing on leather, which I'm sure you'll agree isn't exactly the most appetizing thing. The flavor of your meat might also be off if it's been sitting in your cold storage for too long, or if it's not cooked properly. And don't even get me started on the state of medieval butchering. If you thought modern-day hygiene was bad, imagine a medieval butcher who's working with rudimentary tools and has zero sanitation standards. And let's not forget that medieval food preservation methods weren't exactly foolproof. Without refrigeration, preserving food in the heat of summer could be a nightmare. Without salt or smoke, perishables like meat and fish would spoil in a matter of days. So, you're going to have to learn the art of finding fresh food on the fly, which means foraging for wild herbs, berries, and maybe some mushrooms. But, and this is a big but, medieval foraging wasn't always as safe as it sounds. Some of those wild mushrooms or berries might just be poisonous. And let's face it, no one's got time to waste researching which ones are safe to eat. Historians argue that for many medieval people, food was often a gamble. Whether you were lucky enough to have enough grain or vegetables to last through a harsh winter, or you found yourself at the mercy of bad weather that ruined your crops, your ability to eat was often out of your hands. And since many medieval diets lacked a lot of the vitamins and minerals we take for granted today, the average peasant would have suffered from all kinds of deficiencies, especially scurvy. Now, let's talk about the most important part of the medieval diet: alcohol. Yes, you read that right, alcohol was a staple in your diet, and for good reason. If you wanted to hydrate, you were probably better off drinking ale or wine than water. Why? Because the water supply was, more often than not, contaminated. Rivers were used as dumps for waste, so drinking untreated water was a good way to pick up all kinds of nasty diseases. Ale and wine, however, were boiled or fermented, which meant they were safer to drink. In fact, for many medieval people, a hearty ale or a glass of wine was often safer than water, and it's also much more fun. Historians still debate the long-term effects of alcohol on medieval health. Some argue that, while alcohol might have been safer to drink than water, it also contributed to poor health, especially when consumed in large quantities. Others believe that medieval people had a higher tolerance for alcohol due to the lack of clean drinking water. Regardless, you'd be knocking back some ale every day, whether it's breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and chances are, you wouldn't exactly be feeling your best. All in all, the medieval diet was nothing to write home about. It was bland, repetitive, and often lacking in the things your body needs to thrive. So, if you've got visions of feasting on succulent meats and fine wines, it's time to adjust your expectations. Living in medieval times would mean eating to survive, not eating for pleasure. Let's take a moment to address one of the most basic, and arguably most miserable, aspects of medieval life: hygiene. Now, you probably already have some idea that medieval folk didn't exactly have the luxury of modern plumbing, but let me paint you a picture of just how rough it really was. Imagine this: you wake up in your cold, damp little hut made of mud and thatch. You've probably been sleeping in a pile of straw that's seen better days, and unless you're one of the wealthier folks, there's a good chance your bedding hasn't been washed in a long time. Your hair is probably matted, your body smells less than fresh, and you're pretty sure the only soap you've seen in the last few years was a luxury your lord used. You might even have a few lice or fleas hitching a ride, because personal cleanliness was hardly a top priority for most people. Bathing, for many, was something that happened maybe once or twice a year, and when you did, it involved a quick dip in a cold stream or communal bathhouse. But the real kicker? The medieval understanding of hygiene was, well, let's just say, primitive, might be generous. In fact, many people thought that bathing too much was bad for you, thinking it opened up your pores to disease. Yes, you heard that right. In an era when diseases like the plague were taking their toll, there were widespread beliefs that cleanliness could actually make you sick. So many people avoided regular baths to protect their health. Some even thought that dirt and sweat acted as a protective layer against the bad airs, which, spoiler alert, wasn't actually the cause of disease. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly as dirty as we like to imagine, but one thing is certain: personal hygiene was far from the obsession it is today. It wasn't until later in the medieval period that people started to realize that cleanliness could help prevent disease. But until then, you'd find yourself living in a world where most people weren't exactly worried about germs or the occasional runny nose. Now, let's talk about your teeth, or more accurately, the lack of them. Without toothbrushes or toothpaste, the average person's dental hygiene would make modern orthodontists cringe. If you were lucky, you might chew on some twigs to clean your teeth, but for the most part, people would just let their teeth decay and rot over time. And trust me, you didn't want to go to a medieval dentist. Dentistry in those days was rough, to say the least. Pulling teeth was done without anesthesia, often with a pair of pliers and no regard for your well-being. So, you'd probably have a tooth pulled or 2 or 5, and if you were lucky, your gums wouldn't become infected. But let's be real, you wouldn't look like the smiley toothpaste model you see on TV today. Instead, you'd be stuck with yellow, decaying teeth that would eventually fall out, leaving you to gum your way through your meals. Speaking of infection, the medical practices of the time weren't much better. Sure, if you had a small cut, you might have a chance at survival, but anything more serious? That's where your luck starts to run out. Medieval doctors, many of whom were priests or monks, had a very limited understanding of anatomy and disease. They thought that illness was caused by an imbalance of the body's humors, not bacteria or viruses. And don't get me started on the treatments. Bloodletting was a common remedy, where doctors would drain a little of your blood to try to balance your humors. But in reality, this often made things worse, not better. If you were unlucky enough to get seriously sick, you'd probably end up with a concoction of herbs, leeches, and prayers, none of which would do you much good. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was any worse than it sounds, but the evidence points to the fact that if you were an ordinary person, your chances of surviving an illness were pretty slim. Medicine was more about trial and error than actual science, and many people didn't live long enough to see their 40th birthday because of the lack of proper care. But what about your skin? Well, if you're thinking that life as a medieval peasant meant spotless, clear skin, think again. Many people suffered from rashes, boils, and infections that could easily turn fatal due to poor hygiene and limited access to medicine. And as for the richer folks, well, they weren't much better off. With all those layers of clothing, which weren't washed often, and their tendency to avoid baths, they had a serious problem with body odor. At least they had the luxury of perfumes to mask it. Now I'm sure you're wondering, what about your hands? Sure, you could try to clean up a bit, but you've got to remember that medieval people didn't really have a concept of using hand soap before meals. In fact, eating with your hands was the norm for most of the population. Forget utensils or forks, you'd be using your fingers to shovel up your porridge or break off chunks of bread. And unless you were particularly conscientious about washing your hands, which, let's face it, you wouldn't be, no one was, those fingers were probably covered in dirt, bacteria, and who knows what else. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood just how much dirt and bacteria they were carrying around. But one thing's for sure, their sense of cleanliness was drastically different from ours. Living in the Middle Ages would mean a constant battle against dirt, disease, and discomfort, with little recourse for improving your situation. So, to sum it up, life in the medieval period wasn't exactly a clean affair. Hygiene was rudimentary at best, and if you survived the frequent illnesses, you'd still likely have a hard time getting through a single day without feeling like you're swimming in grime. So, unless you're a fan of living in filth, covered in bodily odors, and fighting off diseases with zero medical knowledge, you might want to reconsider that medieval fantasy. Alright, let's talk about your day-to-day survival strategy in medieval times. Spoiler alert, it's going to be tough, even tougher than it sounds. If you think your life is hard now, just imagine living in an era when the survival rate wasn't much better than your chances of winning the lottery today. But instead of big jackpots, you're betting your life on whether or not you're going to catch a disease, get caught in a raid, or die from malnutrition. Your odds? Well, let's say you might want to make a deal with the local blacksmith for a suit of armor or at least some good luck. First things first, food. This is where the medieval world really starts to show its harshness. Imagine having to scrape by on whatever meager scraps of food you could grow, catch, or steal. And let's not forget, this wasn't the gourmet, farm-to-table lifestyle we're used to now. You might get a chunk of bread if you're lucky, but for the majority of medieval peasants, it was more about what you didn't get. Meat? Ha! You were more likely to eat a vegetable stew with whatever was left over from the last harvest. Sometimes, you'd even find yourself munching on whatever scraps you could find lying around. And don't even think about fresh fruit. Unless you were living in an orchard or had access to a noble's garden, that wasn't happening. Historians still argue whether medieval diets were as bland and limited as we imagine, but the truth is that many people struggled to get enough to eat. Malnutrition was rampant, and while the elite had the luxury of indulging in meats and fancy pastries, the poor lived off of what they could grow or barter, and often just didn't get enough nutrients to stay healthy. You could work your hands to the bone, but if you didn't have a proper diet, your body would just wear down. And remember, this isn't the 3 square meals a day world we live in today. Eating a decent meal was a luxury you might experience on special feast days, not in the daily grind of your medieval existence. So, assuming you somehow make it through the hunger pangs, there's the next thing, the elements. Living in a time where houses were little more than drafty, damp hovels made of stone and wood, you can pretty much kiss any hopes of staying warm goodbye. Winters in medieval Europe were harsh, and there's no such thing as central heating. A fireplace might keep the chill off, but it certainly won't keep you toasty warm in the middle of the night when the freezing air seeps through every crack in your walls. Layering up with whatever clothes you can find is your best bet, but let's face it, it's going to be cold, damp, and uncomfortable. Now let's talk about disease. At this point, you're probably starting to wonder how anyone even survived long enough to make it to adulthood. Well, medieval medicine was about as effective as using a garden rake to defend yourself against a wolf. Doctors, if you could even afford one, had no real understanding of what caused diseases, unless you count the widespread belief that it was all due to the imbalances of your humors or, more terrifyingly, bad air. The Black Death? It swept through Europe, killing a staggering portion of the population, and with no proper treatments, you were basically rolling the dice every time you felt a cough coming on. Add in the regular outbreaks of smallpox, dysentery, and cholera, and you can see why people didn't exactly have long life expectancies. Historians still argue about how much medieval people understood about disease, but the reality is that living in a time of constant plague, illness, and no vaccines meant that even the healthiest of you could drop dead at any time from something as simple as contaminated water. Your immunity wasn't exactly up to modern standards, so your odds of catching something were pretty high. And speaking of catching something, let's not even start on the medieval version of quarantine. It didn't exist. So when the next plague hit, everyone just kept living their life until they fell ill. Alright, now that we've covered the food, the cold, and the endless diseases, let's get into your social life, because, spoiler, it doesn't get much better. First of all, let's assume you're not born into a royal family or one of the wealthy landowning classes. That means you're a peasant, which is essentially medieval speak for don't expect much. You'd probably be living in a small village with others like you, and while that sounds nice in theory, don't forget that you're living in a world with few rights, even fewer comforts, and absolutely no access to any real social mobility. The nobility, of course, had it much better. They had grand estates, servants, and the luxury of being able to eat well, sleep well, and even go on hunting trips. But you're stuck on the land, working tirelessly, living off what you can grow or trade, and praying that you don't get taxed to death by some overzealous lord. In fact, taxes were the medieval version of a bad joke. They could vary from the outright ridiculous to the downright unfair, with nobles demanding payments in the form of goods, livestock, or even the very labor of you and your family. Historians still debate the level of inequality in medieval society, but one thing is certain: if you were a peasant, you had next to no say in anything. You worked hard, lived hard, and prayed that you wouldn't be swept up in the next war or raid that came through your region. You didn't get to vote, you didn't get to voice your opinion, and you certainly didn't have much say in the way the world worked around you. And if you were thinking of taking a vacation? Well, think again. Traveling back then wasn't exactly the luxurious experience it is today. If you had to make a journey, it meant long, dangerous road trips where bandits and thieves were a constant threat, not to mention the risk of starvation and illness. In fact, traveling for pleasure wasn't even a thing. People traveled out of necessity, and your idea of a vacation was probably more like a dangerous pilgrimage to some religious site, hoping to survive the journey and pray for a bit of divine intervention. But let's not be all doom and gloom here. There were a few perks to medieval life. You had the occasional festival, where food and drink were plentiful, and dancing and revelry might temporarily lift the otherwise heavy burden of your existence. And let's not forget the bright spots: a local feast, the arrival of an exciting new piece of news, or the sweet escape of a good story told around the fire. But let's be real. These moments of joy were few and far between, and were no match for the grim realities of medieval survival. Alright, now that you've had a taste of medieval survival, let's get into a more personal issue you'll face: hygiene. And I mean personal hygiene. Think your current morning routine is a hassle? You haven't seen anything yet. The medieval world was one where bathing was an event, and I'm not talking about a relaxing soak in a hot tub with candles flickering around you. No, bathing was an infrequent, labor-intensive ordeal that most people didn't bother with unless it was absolutely necessary. So brace yourself, because you're about to get an up-close and personal look at how cleanliness, or lack thereof, played a huge role in your survival, or lack of it. Let's start with one of the first things you'll notice: you're going to smell. And I'm not talking about a light whiff of sweat after a long day of work. No, medieval life was a world of constant stench. Soap? Not really a thing unless you were very wealthy. The concept of cleanliness was far less about using soaps, shampoos, and deodorants like we do today. You'd likely wash your hands or face with water, but body baths? That would be a rare treat. Most people relied on quick, often cold, sponge baths, or none at all for weeks or even months on end. Think about it. Living in an age with no central plumbing or sewers meant that most people simply avoided a full-body bath altogether. The wealthy could afford to have bathhouses, but even they didn't do it daily. So, how's that for a lifestyle upgrade? Historians still argue whether medieval people really smelled that bad, or whether our modern noses are just more sensitive to things like body odor. What's clear, though, is that bathing wasn't part of the daily routine, and over time, the lack of personal hygiene contributed to diseases like lice, scabies, and other skin conditions. It's not just about the smell, it's about the fact that when you go weeks without a proper clean, your chances of picking up an illness go way up. And don't even get me started on the medieval haircut. You're likely going to leave the barber with more than just a fresh trim. You'll probably catch a nice batch of lice, too. At least you won't need a reminder of your existence. They'll be buzzing around your head 24/7. Let's take a detour into your teeth. You know that feeling when you haven't brushed your teeth in a while and you get that fuzzy, uncomfortable sensation in your mouth? Now imagine that feeling all the time. That's your life in the medieval world. Toothbrushes weren't a thing, and dental care didn't even exist. Sure, people might have tried using twigs or cloths to clean their teeth, but this was mostly for show. By the time you reached your 30s, your teeth would probably be in a sorry state. Teeth extraction was the closest thing to dental work, and if you had a toothache, well, that was just one more thing you had to pray would go away on its own. Spoiler alert, it probably wouldn't. Historically, people didn't seem to be as obsessed with their teeth as we are today, but with all the sugars and carbohydrates in their diet, tooth decay was rampant. Tooth loss? A given. But hey, at least you had a nice set of brown, missing teeth to match the rest of your personal hygiene woes. Okay, let's take a quick look at your living space. I hope you're not expecting anything too fancy. Let's face it, you're living in a drafty, dark room that smells like a mixture of wet straw and damp earth. The bed? Oh, it's a luxurious pile of straw with a rough wool blanket thrown over it. Good luck trying to sleep through the night while the rats scurry over your bed, possibly nibbling on your feet. And considering that medieval mattresses were often shared with critters, you're just as likely to find yourself fighting off a case of fleas as you are a peaceful night's sleep. You're going to have to get used to the idea that your living situation isn't exactly a 5-star experience. Privacy? That's a joke. You're lucky if you get a small corner in a one-room hut shared with your entire family, or even a neighbor or two. And forget about furniture, as we know it. Your table will likely double as a place to sleep when you're not using it for your meals. The chair you sit in? It might be just a wooden block. As for your kitchen, it's basically a small fire pit with a few pots to cook whatever food you've managed to gather for the week. If you're lucky, you might have access to a small garden, assuming you don't eat it all by winter. Historians still argue whether the average medieval person was more aware of their personal hygiene and living conditions than we think. But one thing's for sure, the lack of privacy, space, and cleanliness would be a constant source of frustration. You're going to get used to being cramped, dirty, and frankly uncomfortable. Moving on to one of the more grim aspects of your medieval life, illness and injury. You'll need to pray you don't get sick or hurt, because if you do, there's a good chance that your fate is sealed. Medieval medicine was about as effective as using leeches to fix your broken leg. Wait, that's right. You might actually have to deal with that. Most injuries were handled with a mix of superstition and basic remedies, but don't expect any painkillers or sterile tools. A lot of the time, if you broke a bone or got an infection, your best bet was to just hope for the best. Surgeons, yes, there were such things as medieval surgeons, could fix broken bones or remove an infected tooth, but the chances of surviving a simple infection or wound were slim. An infected wound could lead to sepsis, and your chances of recovery from that were slim to none. If you caught anything like the plague, smallpox, or any other deadly disease, it was basically a countdown to the end. Hygiene and sanitation weren't exactly top priorities, so diseases spread like wildfire, and with no antibiotics, your survival rate wasn't great. Now, imagine all that combined with the fact that you're constantly working the land or dealing with whatever task your lord has assigned to you. Life in medieval times was brutal, and your chances of making it out of your 30s weren't great, especially if you didn't have the fortune of being a noble or wealthy merchant. Historians argue whether life expectancy was actually as low as we think, especially when considering that many didn't survive childbirth or early childhood. But the truth remains that medieval people lived hard and often died young, either from disease, accidents, or just plain bad luck. Now that you've settled into the grim realities of medieval life, let's take a little detour to a more glamorous aspect of the time, the medieval food system. If you thought that you were going to be enjoying 3 square meals a day with a side of fresh fruits and veggies, I've got some bad news for you. Medieval food, at least for the average person, wasn't exactly a Michelin star experience. In fact, it was more about surviving than thriving, and what you ate was directly tied to your social status. Let's start with the peasants, who, if you're in their shoes, will be living off a diet that mostly consists of bread. But not the fancy kind of bread that you get today, all light and fluffy. No, you're getting the coarse, heavy bread made from rye or barley. This might sound familiar if you've ever tasted a dense loaf of sourdough, but trust me, after eating it for every meal, you're going to be more than ready for a change. But of course, that's not going to happen unless you can somehow afford to get your hands on something more luxurious. You'll probably also get a bit of porridge. Thankfully, it's warm, but it's bland. If you're lucky, you might get some vegetables with it, though those are typically limited to whatever you can grow yourself. No farmers' markets to shop at, just whatever you can manage to cultivate in your own small plot of land. The idea of going to the store and picking up a ready-made meal? Forget about it. You're either growing your own food, hunting for it, or, if you're lucky, trading for it. Speaking of hunting, let's talk about meat. If you're not one of the wealthier folks, meat will be a rare treat. For the lower classes, the idea of getting a juicy roast chicken or a tender steak is just a dream. What you'll mostly be eating is salted or dried meats, like bacon or jerky. It's not exactly the farm-to-table freshness that you'd hope for, but it'll keep you alive. But for the rich folks? Well, that's a whole different ballgame. The nobility had access to a far more diverse and luxurious menu. They could enjoy freshly roasted meats like venison, boar, and even peacock, yes, peacock. These meals would be served with a variety of sauces and spices imported from the Middle East, and if you had a particularly wealthy household, you might even have access to sugar, something that was as valuable as gold at the time. But even then, food wasn't always a matter of taste. The rich were known to overindulge, often eating to excess, resulting in obesity, gout, and other health issues that would ultimately be their downfall. Historians still debate whether the stark food disparity between the peasants and the nobility was as extreme as we imagine it, or whether it's more of a historical exaggeration. However, it's clear that medieval diets were highly stratified, and unless you had wealth or land, you were likely eating whatever you could get your hands on. The sheer volume of bread, porridge, and dried meat you'll be consuming might make you wish for something a little more exciting. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate what you'll be drinking. If you're living in medieval times, your options are a bit limited. Water? It's probably going to make you sick, especially if you're living in a city where sanitation isn't exactly top-notch. So, what do you drink? Well, ale. Ale is going to be your go-to beverage, whether you like it or not. But before you get too excited thinking that medieval ale is like the craft brews you can pick up today, let me tell you that it's probably going to taste like something you wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole if it were sitting on a modern shelf. It's often flat, weak, and brewed in a way that makes today's worst supermarket beers look like top-shelf brews. But hey, at least you're getting a drink that's technically safe to drink, unlike the contaminated water that might make you seriously regret your decision to take a sip. Ale is the safe choice, and it's pretty much your only option for staying hydrated, aside from a bit of wine, which, like ale, was often watered down. Wine for the average medieval person wasn't quite the fine vintage you'd expect today, but it was still a far more dignified drink than the watery ale that most peasants had to suffer through. Historians still argue whether medieval people drank more than we do today because of the fact that water wasn't safe, or whether their drinking habits were exaggerated over time. But one thing is clear, ale was a staple of medieval life. Whether you were peasant or noble, you were drinking it daily. And since it was a lot weaker than modern beer, it's safe to say that medieval people were probably a little more chilled out than we imagine. Let's shift gears and focus on one of the more colorful aspects of medieval life, fashion. But be warned, it's not the glamorous, Instagram-ready outfits you might be envisioning. If you were a peasant in medieval times, your wardrobe was mostly made up of rough, woolen tunics, and you'd probably wear the same outfit day in and day out until it was threadbare. Forget about choosing from a variety of clothes. You had one basic outfit that did the job, and that was it. You might even be wearing it in the summer. No breathable cotton for you, my friend, just thick wool to trap all the heat and make you sweat through every day. Noblemen had a bit more variety in their wardrobe. They could wear long robes, doublets, and hats adorned with fur. As for noblewomen, their dresses were made from finer fabrics like silk and velvet, and they could even afford to have their clothes dyed in bright colors, which were a sign of wealth. But the question remains, how long would you be able to keep your clothes looking fresh? In a world where hygiene isn't exactly a priority, your clothes probably smell as bad as your body does after weeks of neglecting a proper bath. The nobles might have had the finest fabrics, but they still couldn't escape the harsh realities of medieval hygiene. Historians still argue whether medieval fashion was as uncomfortable as it sounds, but one thing is certain: medieval people didn't have the luxury of the soft, breathable clothing we enjoy today. Whether you're a noble or a peasant, you're going to be stuck with scratchy, sweaty fabrics for most of your life. Let's step away from food, drink, and fashion for a bit, and talk about something a bit more grim: your living arrangements. If you think that a medieval castle would be the epitome of luxury, let me stop you right there. First off, the vast majority of people lived in small, cramped houses or huts, many of which were made from wattle and daub, a technique involving woven branches covered with mud or clay. You're probably thinking, hey, that sounds like a quaint little cottage. But trust me, it wasn't as cozy as it sounds. These homes had 1 or 2 rooms at most, with a dirt floor that's going to be cold and damp. And as for furniture, it wasn't exactly like you could go to IKEA and pick up a comfy armchair. Most furniture was handcrafted and crude, with minimal space for sleeping and living. Think of a single bed, a crude table, and some simple stools, and that's about it. You'll probably be sharing that bed with family members or a few of your animals, as pets, and hygiene weren't exactly a priority. And don't think you're getting a good night's sleep either. The medieval bed wasn't so much a comfy mattress as it was a bunch of straw piled up on the floor, sometimes covered by a basic blanket. There's a decent chance that bugs, rodents, or even lice will be your nightly companions. And if that doesn't sound bad enough, the temperature inside your home isn't much better than outside. Medieval houses didn't have central heating, obviously, so in the winter, you're freezing cold and huddled around a fire to stay warm. The smoke from that fire is going to fill your house, giving you a constant cough and making everything smell like burned wood. But hey, at least it's warmish, right? The wealthy weren't exactly living in castles like the ones we see in fairy tales either. The grandeur of a noble's home was often exaggerated, with castles having stone walls that were cold and often damp. They might have had luxurious tapestries hanging on the walls to add a bit of warmth and comfort, but the floors were still made of stone or wood. If you're one of the lucky few who has a castle to call home, congratulations. At least you won't be dealing with the daily threat of collapsing walls. But that stone isn't going to be any more comfortable than the mud and wattle hut you were hoping to escape. Historians still argue whether the medieval living experience was worse for the wealthy due to their isolation, or whether it was truly brutal for everyone. But in the end, no one was living in luxury. Even with the bigger houses, the lack of sanitation, the cold temperatures, and the shared living conditions make it clear that comfort wasn't the top priority in any era of medieval life. No matter where you landed on the social ladder, you were going to be uncomfortable in some form or another. While your living conditions might be grim, let's talk about one of the most important parts of surviving medieval times: hygiene. You'd probably think that hygiene wasn't exactly high on people's lists in medieval times, and you'd be right. The concept of cleanliness wasn't exactly the same back then. You'll probably be lucky to get a bath once a year, and even that might be a community event with no privacy. Water is scarce, and your bath is going to consist of a tub that's filled with water that's shared with multiple people, so by the time you're done, it's not exactly a refreshing dip. Let's not forget about the other essentials, like brushing your teeth. Toothbrushes weren't even a thing, and toothpaste was far from what we know today. If you had the resources, you might chew on a stick or use crushed herbs to try to clean your teeth. But don't get too attached to that idea. Tooth decay and bad breath were pretty much a given. If you wanted to avoid a mouthful of cavities, your best bet was to stay away from sweet foods, which were rare anyway. But hygiene doesn't stop at brushing your teeth. No, it goes beyond that. You're probably going to be spending your life with some unpleasant smells, whether from sweat, lack of deodorant, or the general lack of showers. Deodorant was non-existent, and people didn't wash their clothes often, so you can imagine the general aroma of medieval towns and villages. Most people relied on strong-smelling herbs or flowers to mask the odors, but I wouldn't call it a solution, more of a temporary fix. Historians still argue whether medieval people were fully aware of how filthy their living conditions were. Some suggest they simply didn't have a concept of cleanliness the way we do today, while others argue that people simply adapted to their circumstances. Either way, it's clear that hygiene was pretty low on the priority list, and unless you were one of the incredibly rare few with the luxury of a private bath, you'll be stuck with a life of dirt, bad smells, and questionable sanitary practices. Speaking of life in towns, you're probably going to be living in a village or small town that's crowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Medieval cities didn't exactly have the best urban planning, so you'll likely be dealing with narrow, unpaved streets filled with waste and filth. Public hygiene wasn't great, and many cities had a distinct odor of manure, human waste, and rotting food. If you thought walking through a modern city with traffic fumes was bad, wait until you experience medieval life with an even less breathable atmosphere. And speaking of danger, don't think that living in a village is going to keep you safe. Bandits, thieves, and the occasional marauding group of soldiers or raiders were a constant threat. You'd need to be prepared to defend yourself, or at least rely on the local lord's protection if you're lucky. Life was constantly precarious, and even a minor conflict could escalate quickly, especially with medieval justice often involving harsh punishments, executions, and torture. Now that you've seen the living conditions and the lack of modern amenities, let's talk about your work life in medieval times. You think your job is tough now? You haven't experienced anything like the grueling manual labor that was common back then. Most people worked as farmers or in some form of skilled trade, and no, that doesn't mean working from the comfort of your home with a cup of coffee in hand. You'll be working long hours, often from sunrise to sunset, and your breaks are few and far between. The idea of a weekend, or any time off, doesn't really exist. There's no sick leave either. If you're too ill to work, you're simply out of luck. For farmers, your entire life will revolve around the seasons. You'll rise with the sun, work the land with basic tools like a plow, pulled by oxen or horses, and spend hours tilling, sowing, and harvesting crops. You're going to feel like you've been hit by a truck at the end of each day. No cushy office chair to sink into, just aching muscles and the ever-present threat of crop failure. And don't even think about outsourcing your work. If the harvest fails, that's your family's food and livelihood gone for the year. You'd better hope the weather cooperates, because any disaster like a bad winter or a wet summer could wipe you out completely. Historians still argue about how much medieval life for peasants revolved around sheer survival. While many claim that people had relatively steady lives if things went well, the constant risk of famine, disease, and war meant that life was often a delicate balancing act. Your wealth and success depended entirely on your crops, livestock, and the mood of the weather gods, and I don't need to tell you how unreliable those were. But farming isn't the only job you could have. If you're lucky enough to be an artisan, you might work in a trade like blacksmithing, weaving, or pottery. But don't get too excited about working with metal or creating fine clothing. Medieval tools were basic, and the working conditions could be dangerous. A blacksmith's forge was a hot, sweaty place, where you'd be surrounded by flames, hammers, and metal. Imagine working with your bare hands, making everything from horseshoes to weapons, with zero health and safety regulations to protect you. You're basically living in a constant state of exhaustion, sore muscles, and, if you're unlucky, burns and injuries. Let's not forget that most towns had a hierarchy when it came to these skilled trades. The master artisans were the ones calling the shots, and the apprentices were the ones doing all the hard work. If you're an apprentice, get ready for a life of low pay, long hours, and constant supervision. You'll be learning on the job, constantly performing repetitive tasks until you eventually learn the trade enough to move up. But in the meantime, you'll probably be living in your master's workshop or home, with very little time to yourself. Sound like a dream job? Well, the dream's going to be very slow to come true. And if you thought working in a small town was your way out, think again. Medieval towns were noisy, chaotic, and often overcrowded, with little in the way of sanitation. Work isn't just about doing your job, it's about dealing with the stench of human waste in the streets, animals roaming free, and the constant clamor of people. Sure, the community might have a market, but it's just as likely to have a pig running through it while the local tavern serves up low-quality ale. If you need to buy anything, be prepared to haggle with the vendors and shopkeepers who, let's be real, don't care much about offering a polite service. They're trying to make a living, just like you. But you've got one thing on your side, the church. Now, I know you're probably thinking about religion as some sort of comforting presence, but let me be clear. While it offered some moral and spiritual guidance, it was also a central part of your daily life and, frankly, your work life. The church controlled everything. It owned land, collected taxes, and even influenced who could work in various professions. If you were a skilled worker, there's a good chance the guild you belonged to was controlled by the local clergy. The church was also responsible for keeping track of the calendar, which determined when you could or couldn't work. There's a good chance you'd be working more holidays than not, and trust me, that church bell will ring early. And speaking of taxes, don't forget that no one gets away with not paying their dues. Kings and lords didn't just ask for taxes, they demanded them. Whether you were a peasant, a merchant, or even an artisan, you'll have to pay your share. The higher up you are in society, the higher the tax rates, unless, of course, you have the good fortune of being exempt. And for everyone else, your taxes aren't just used for public goods like roads and security. Oh no, they go straight into the pockets of the rulers and the church, and if you're late with payments, there's a good chance you'll see some harsh consequences. Historians still debate how much medieval taxation really impacted people's day-to-day lives. Some claim that it was a major factor in peasant revolts, while others argue that taxation was an accepted part of the feudal system. Either way, it's clear that there was no escaping the financial burden of medieval life. So, now that you've got the basic picture of life in medieval times, let's wrap things up with what you could expect in terms of personal freedom, or, more accurately, your lack of it. If you think you're about to have any say in how you live your life, think again. In medieval society, most people didn't get to choose much of anything. From where you lived to who you married, the choices were usually made for you. And I'm not talking about the occasional parental input. I'm talking about a complete lack of personal autonomy. Take marriage, for instance. Sure, you probably imagine yourself marrying for love, in some grand, romantic ceremony. Well, in medieval times, love had very little to do with it. Marriages were arranged, and they were often more about securing alliances, property, and titles than about romantic feelings. If you're lucky enough to be of noble birth, your marriage could even be dictated by the whims of your family or ruler. For the peasants, it's not any better. Your choice of spouse? Likely influenced by what your family could afford, your status in the village, and whether you were deemed a suitable match by the local priest. You thought you'd find true love, but in the medieval world, love was often as much a luxury as a warm bath. And if you thought that after marriage you'd be free to make your own decisions, think again. Men were, of course, the head of the household, but it wasn't just husbands who had the final say. Everyone in the family, including the children, had their roles set for them. Women's roles were mostly centered around running the household, bearing children, and supporting their husbands. If you were a noblewoman, there was a chance you'd have some influence, but the reality was, your freedom to do anything beyond what was required of you was pretty slim. Let's not even get started on social mobility, because there's basically none. If you're born into a peasant family, guess what? You're staying a peasant. There are no rags to riches stories here. Even in noble families, your social class was largely set in stone, and it was rare for anyone to rise above their station. Your opportunities were pretty much laid out for you from birth, and they usually involve hard labor, limited education, and the hope that you die in old age without seeing your world change. Want to break free from the class system? Good luck. It was as locked in as a dungeon cell. Historians still debate how rigid the social hierarchy was. Some believe that the rise of trade and cities in the late medieval period offered new opportunities for social mobility, while others argue that the feudal system kept people trapped in their stations for centuries. Either way, unless you were royalty or had some serious connections, your chances of changing your fate were incredibly slim. And speaking of your fate, let's talk about death, because in medieval times, you had a lot of chances to meet it. Life expectancy was low. The average medieval person wouldn't live to see 40, and if you did, you were considered unusually lucky. Disease, poor nutrition, and violence were constant threats, and if you survived childhood, your health was probably fragile at best. The plagues? They were inevitable, and there were no vaccines or antibiotics to save you. You could wake up one day, feeling fine, and be gone by nightfall, especially if there was a plague sweeping through your town. Even worse, you'd probably die in pain, since medical treatment was primitive at best and, at worst, completely ineffective. Medieval medicine was based on a combination of superstition, limited knowledge, and strange practices. Bloodletting, leeching, and herbal remedies were the norm. Sure, some of those remedies worked occasionally, but the likelihood of dying from an infection or complication was far greater than surviving a small illness. If you broke a bone, you were in serious trouble. You might not survive the wound, or you might suffer permanent disability. And if you were in a battle or a skirmish, you were looking at a high chance of being maimed or killed, and not in a heroic way, probably something gruesome. The idea of a peaceful death, surrounded by loved ones, wasn't something most medieval folks experienced. Death was an event, and for many, it was an unexpected one. It was common for families to lose multiple members in a short span, especially when illness or famine struck. Grief was something that could become a daily reality, with little time or resources to mourn. And the afterlife? The Church promised that those who lived a pious life would be rewarded in heaven, but given that sin was always lurking just beneath the surface, most people feared damnation. Life was hard, death was unpredictable, and salvation was uncertain. So, the next time you're frustrated by a modern inconvenience or complain about the stresses of your job, take a moment to think about medieval times. You would be working yourself to the bone, with little hope of advancement, and at any moment, the world around you could change drastically due to disease or warfare. Your fate would be decided long before you even reached adulthood, and your idea of freedom would be very different from the one you have now. Trust me, life wasn't easy back then. You probably wouldn't last a day,